Good morning. In this morning's session, before we get started, Tam is going to do a reading from Brecht.
Manifesto, the next 50 lines after last night. Okay. Thus came about the age, which now is ending, of the bourgeois. A fleeing serf, he became a burgher of the market town, then of the city, and behind its secure walls the guilds flourish. Sloth keeps crossing the walls, and commerce awakens the dreaming country. Seaports build ships that sail to new shores, busily round Africa, and set courageous sights on American gold. Opening Chinese and East Indian markets, the New World, the accumulation of wares and monies give wings to manufacture. And powerful there appears from feudal relations a new societal ruler, the burgher. Industry overtakes crafts. Long will endure the distaff, but the master crosses the market with less resounding footsteps. And work once divided by guilds is now by the factory owner divided within one bigger workshop, and still the markets insatiably grow. Even manufacture can no longer fill the new demands, and lo, machines and steam overturn all again, and manufacturer gives way to captain of industry, commander of workers, and financier, our bourgeois. The teachers show us in detail how large machine-based industry created a worldwide market. And the market in turn helped to concentrate industry till the bourgeoisie had fought its way to eminent rule. State power attends to the business of the bourgeoisie now, clothed in pomp and purple raiment, a willing executive board. And this class has proved a hard and most impatient mistress. With brazen cheek and iron heel, it stamped out the rotten patriarchally still idyll, tore up the feudal old motley ties that bound protector and protege, permitting no nexus but naked self-interest between people, payment in cash. The chivalric masters and loyal servants, love of native soil, honest craftsmanship, serving a cause or inner calling, it has drowned in the icy jet of calculation, and brutally sold off dignity of persons as small change. In place of the numberless chartered freedoms, it set up a sole freedom of trade. No doubt those ties were a natural, pious exploitation. Now it is naked and shamelessly wielded. Physician and priest and judge and poet and researcher in the past still met with pious awe. It hires as workers for wage, sends to a doctor the ailing as paying customers, and he sells his recipe, and the priest sells his consolation. Justice may now be purchased from the watchman of property, the judge. Whatever plows its inventor imagined, its dealer sells for swords. Hungrily the artist glorifies, with quick, nobilitating brushstroke, the bourgeoisie's visage. Burst in the artifices of art, he massages for money the ladies' languid emotions. Smirking, the bourgeois turns the poets and thinkers into paid lackeys. The temple of knowledge becomes a stock exchange, and even the family's holy abode, hustling, he stamps with the seal of unholy tattling.
Thank you very much, Sam. So our session this morning is Michael Roberts speaking on the world economy in the 2020s. So he's going to speak for about half an hour and then we'll open it up to discussion.
Well, morning everybody. Nice to see some familiar faces again. A couple of times I've been physically at the Communist University, and I'm pleased to be here again. This is an historic day because our President Donald Trump, the man who is going to make America great again, same age as me, has announced yet another round of tariffs overnight, designed to restrict exports into the US from all countries of the world, and by doing so, or raise funds if they are imported through tariffs, which is basically a tax on imports. You'll be glad to hear that the penguins of Pearl Island have been exempted this time and will no longer have to pay import tariffs if they export themselves into the United States. But other countries are taking big increase in tariffs. The quick look through today, it's very difficult to work out who's going to get hit and who isn't. There's lots of exemptions and so on. Things are put off for another week, and in the case of China, put off for another 90 days. So it is more confusion in Trump's tariff tantrums. I'll come back to that in my presentation towards the end, but I want to give you a general quick picture of what's going on in the world economy in the 2020s as we're halfway through that decade now, and to get a view about where it's been going and what's going to happen over the next period in relation to what Trump has said. Now, oops, are you going to do it there, are you? Is it not working here? Yeah, here we go. Okay, so the first thing to note is that world economies combined into a world economy, if you like, are stagnating. Real GDP growth, this is a 5-year rolling average. You can see going back to the 1980s, we see a rise up until the end of the century, 20th century, and since then, a gradual falling back in the rate of growth in world real GDP growth. So that's national outputs all aggregated together, excluding inflation, taking inflation out of the equation, and then you get a growth rate. It's up and down, as we can see. We've had the period of the Great Recession in 2008-9, then we had the pandemic slump, which is heavy, then a recovery. But generally, that's the long-term process that's going on. So in this 21st century, growth rates in all the major economies of the world are slowing down. And that's an important thing, because if growth rates are slowing down, incomes are not going to be able to be sustained at the same level of increase. And all the other services and things, products that people need, even if they don't get them, will not be increasing enough to match even the growth in population. So we still have growth in population at the moment. Population growth is slowing, but it's still rising at the moment. And therefore, a falling rate of growth in real GDP means there's less to increase than an increasing population. Now, what's going to happen? Well, the World Bank has done a few recent surveys, and I'd just like to, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that what they're saying is that the growth rate is going to be slowing down in all major areas in the world economy to around about 3% a year, where it used to be much higher than that. And if you look at the second graph on the bottom here, that's business investment, which is key to capitalism. If there's not investment, then there can't be further growth of employment and income. And you can see that the trajectory, which is the black line for the 21st century, was up until 2008 along that black line there. That's where it would have gone if the average had continued. But then we had the Great Recession in 2008-9, and then we had the pandemic slump. So the red line is actually what's happened. So the trend growth rate is not being maintained, it's dropped away, there's a huge gap. That gap in business investment can never be replaced. That's a loss of investment into the economy and services forever. Even if it recovers now, that hole will remain, and that has been lost. These are the World Bank's figures. And now they forecast that this will slice 0.5 percentage point off of the global GDP growth rate, cutting it to around about just over 2% now. So that's the world growth rate. That includes China. That includes India. That includes Indonesia. That includes all the fast-growing economies. That's the weakest performance in 17 years outside of global recessions. And by 2027, says the World Bank, will average just 2.5% in the 2020s. So the 7 years of the 2020s will be growing for the world at 2.5%, the slowest pace of any decade since the 1960s. So that's an indication of how the situation is worsening for global capitalism. And we'll come back to the question raised in the Brecht reading that if free trade and world markets are no longer expanding to provide extra profits and production for world capitalism because the world is slowing down. The World Bank says, as I say, that the per capita GDP, that's the amount per person in high-income economies, that's places like Britain, the G7, will be roughly where it was expected to be before the COVID pandemic. But developing countries will be way worse, except for China. It will take these economies about 2 decades to recoup the economic losses of the 2020s. So all the countries outside the imperialist core of Europe, Japan, and North America, on average, except for China, they are declining quite sharply as a result of the 2 recessions they've had, and the situation is getting worse. Population goes up, GDP is not matching it, so that per capita GDP is beginning to lower and is not going to return to any of the levels it had before. So, in other words, far from the poorest country making any progress in improving living standards in these most populated places, these countries are dropping further behind. Poverty rates are rising, not falling. That's the situation in 2025. And why is this? Well, it's because, as I showed in the previous graph, there's a falling investment growth. Investment is growing, but it's not growing anything as fast as it used to. We take investment to GDP, that's the rate of amount of investment made by capitalist companies relative to the amount of output produced, that's investment to GDP. If you look at the period of about 40 years here, we can see that if we go right down the bottom here, look at the advanced economies, the red line, that the investment to GDP was about 25% in the 1980s. It's dropped below 22%, much less than 3% of GDP. But that's an awful lot of GDP for all the economies involved in the advanced countries. There's been a 10% fall. And the rate is fell below 20% for most of the advanced economies during the Great Recession. Only one country has maintained a level of investment to GDP and increased it even in this period, and that is China. But if we exclude China, the light blue line, you can see that the general fall in the investment to GDP ratio. So we've got growth slowing, we've got per capita income, that's per person income slowing in growth, and we've got the investment to GDP dropping back relative to the GDP. Why is this? Now, in my view, as a Marxist economist, I think what decides investment in growth is profits for capitalists. The production does not place for social need. Big capitalist companies do not produce things because people need them. They realize that they have to need them in order to sell them, but they only produce them if they make a profit. If they don't make a profit, they will stop producing them or they will stop investing in such products. And what we've had over the last 70 years here is a gradual fall in the rate of profit in the major capitalist economies, G7, the imperialist economies. Using the latest series that we've now got available, we can see that way back in the 60s, the golden age of capitalism, there was actually a slight increase in the rate of profit. It was relatively high, around about just under 15% relative to the total amount of capital invested. And it then dropped dramatically during the 1970s. Then the period from the early 1980s up until the end of the 20th century, we see a recovery in the rate of profit, which is due to what is called now neoliberalism. What does that mean? That means privatization. That means shifting manufacturing to the poorer countries to take advantage of higher profits to be made out of exploiting workers in those countries. It means smashing trade unions. It means reducing the ability of government services to provide support for people, welfare state cuts, and so on. All those measures that we all know about in the last 40 years enabled, on the whole, the rate of profit to rise for a period of time up until the end of the 20th century. But there's inexorably a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. That couldn't be maintained because as investment expanded, it expanded relative to labour, and only labour creates value under Marxist theory, and therefore profits tend to not rise enough to match the increase in cost of production. Oops, what happened there? So we can see from the end of the 20th century, we have a fallback right down to the to the point of the pandemic slump, where it's fallen down by at least 30% to its lowest level ever. It's made a significant recovery in the last few years since the pandemic, but it's still at a very low level. So that's the main reason for the fall in investment. This is creating a general crisis for capitalism. There's a phrase used quite often now in circles claiming a polycrisis. There's components of a crisis for capitalism way beyond what the Brecht readings were talking about, the expansion of capitalism. Now it's the opposite case. We have a series of crises coming together, not just the economic crisis, not just the slowdown, not just the weakness of capitalist investment, but also the impact that it's having on the rest of the world. Global poverty is actually increasing. A staggering 2.7 billion people can only cover their basic needs for a month or less without income. And of that number, nearly 1 billion could only survive for a week if they had a loss of income. Even including China, there are 3.65 billion people on the planet below the $6.85 a day poverty line, according to the World Bank. Just think they consider that the poverty line, just about $7 a day. Anything below that is the poverty line, according to the World Bank. You might think that's rather a low figure. If you raised it higher, say to $10 a day or $15 a day, you'd be way more than 4 billion people. So poverty is increasing. There's no sign that it's going to be reduced. It will not be eliminated. Here's a position of the World Bank. They summarize, without drastic action, it could take decades to eradicate extreme poverty and more than a century to eliminate poverty as it is defined for nearly half the world. Well, more than a century, I don't know, none of us are going to be here. So basically what they're saying is poverty cannot be eliminated under capitalism. That's what they're really saying. It'll take more than a century. Well, there's no sign even it's being reduced, let alone within a century at all. So that's the situation on poverty. On the other hand, we have a small group of people, a tiny group of people who have immense wealth in the world. Here is the lineup at the inauguration of our hero being inaugurated, and there's the lineup of all those super rich tech moguls in a line. It was quite handy. I thought maybe we could capture them all at once, but never mind. The wealth at the top 0.0001% as a share of total US is equivalent to 3.1 trillion out of 148 trillion. So just those people on the photograph are getting $3.1 trillion in wealth between them alone, which is a huge amount. And I'll make that, if I can focus on the next graph, is it? Not yet, but there is a graph which shows inequality in the world. I always like to make this point. It's a pyramid right at the top. Now, there's vast majority of people have got no wealth at all, personal wealth at all, personal wealth, this is other wealth. And 10% have a bit of wealth. The top 10% you think in the world must be very rich. You're all in the top 10%. That shows you how poor the rest of the world is relative to you. And of course, above you is the 0.1%. Then the other major component of crisis, of course, is global warming and climate change. New predictions now that have a 70% chance that global temperatures will exceed the 1.5 degree above pre-industrial levels temperature, global temperature, set as the limit by the Paris Agreement of 2015. That's going to be exceeded. Probably already has. It's about 1.4% at the moment. I just saw the latest figures showing that the first half of 2025 will be the second hottest year in history. The hottest year was 2024. 2025 is going to be slightly cooler, but it's still going to be close to the 1.5 degrees increase in temperatures. And for the first time, climate models showing there's a possibility that will exceed 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels before the end of this decade. And what is being done about this? Well, those are the figures to show that 2024, and then you see a picture on the right here of the head upwards, how this is accelerating beyond the 1.5 towards 2%. And if we get beyond 1.5 and 2%, this is catastrophic for extreme weather, for all sorts of droughts, for floods, particularly in the poorest parts of the world, and it will increase dramatically the need for people to be displaced, migrating around the world. Just imagine the tensions that's going to produce. And the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are now reaching its highest point in 800,000 years. 2024 is the hottest year, as I said, and the average temperature is rising all the time. So we're having a massive increase in carbon dioxide emissions, but also all the other greenhouse gas emissions like methane, which is really dangerous in society, for human beings and the planet in general. So that this is a situation which is completely out of control. There is no real attempt to reduce it. Nearly 1.8 billion people, about 90% of the South Asian population, will be exposed to dangerous temperatures by the end of this decade. And that out of 60% of households and firms already have experienced in this region extreme weather in the past 5 years, and more than 75% expect such events to increase in the next decade. So in South Asia, what is South Asia? That's India, that's Sri Lanka, that's Pakistan, that's all those areas in Southeast Asia as well. These areas are going to suffer really badly, particularly places like Bangladesh, which is a very low level. So basically they'll be flooded out of sight if they're not already burnt up. Now, what is being done by capitalism? Well, here's the answer from two people who ought to know, our fossil fuel giants and CEOs. Phasing out fossil fuels is a fantasy, says the head of Saudi Aramco, chief executive. By the way, he was in charge of the last climate change discussion, which makes a joke of the whole thing. We should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas and instead invest in them adequately, reflecting realistic demand. In other words, we want to go on producing to make money, and we're not going to pay any attention to what's happening with global emissions. You can argue green all day and you NGOs all day, but those are the facts. I think that's the message beginning to resonate, says the head of ExxonMobil. And you're right, it is resonating. The banks have given up their so-called ethical lending. Most governments are not paying any attention to the fact that the limits are being exceeded on carbon dioxide and on temperature. There's just an attempt, and of course, the biggest country, the most important economic country in the world, has a leader who says, drill, baby, drill. There will be no end to the process of increase in fossil fuel production. So there we have two parts of the components. We've got the poverty, they have done the economics, we've got the poverty, and we've got climate change. These are the things happening in the 21st century as quickly increasing in its dangers towards the end of this decade. Next component is the end of globalization. Our reading told about free trade. Well, forget free trade now. Free trade has gone out the window. The World Trade Organization, which is supposed to provide free trade and agreements, has basically been totally ignored. Nobody's interested in the World Trade Organization anymore. And you can see what's happened to global trade as a percentage of GDP. It reached its peak at about 60% of world GDP, global trade, in just before the Great Recession, but since then it has been declining. So trade is no longer an avenue for escape for capitalist economies if they're not growing fast enough. And because of that, there's an increased tension and a desire for the brothers of capitalism now to fight each other in hostile way to try and get more trade share against the others. And of course, the program of Donald is exactly designed, as far as he's concerned, to increase the position of the US in trade by applying import tariffs against the rest of the world. Import tariffs, by the way, just on goods, not on services, just on goods. So we now have Trump's trade war, and now we're in a position where increasingly we're going to see tensions mount not only on trade, but on investment and on the ability of each of these countries to cooperate. It's all going to disappear. We're increasingly going to have these counter movements across the board. So far, it seems that the leaders of Europe, Sakir, President Macron, Merz, and of course Ursula as the head of the EU Commission, are prepared to bow down before the Donald and accept whatever terms he wants to make on a new deal. But countries like China are not prepared to do that. They're being very tough about how they're prepared to accept it. It's very interesting that Trump has actually given them another 90 days before he increases the tariffs on Chinese exports, the most important one for the US, if that's what the aim is to do. And that's an indication that the tensions are still to come when it comes down to this trade war, because this trade war isn't really about so much making America great again by increasing manufacturing for the US at home and stopping exports from other countries coming into the US, because trade for the US is relatively small. It's a big economy. Most of production transactions are domestic ones. So that's what it's not really about. It's about trying to squeeze the other countries, weaken their position relative to the US, in particular China. Just to show you, this is the very latest figure as before yesterday of how much tariffs have risen. And you can see back in the see how heavy the tariffs were in the 19th century. There was no free trade. It came much later, and gradually it came through into the 20th century. And by the 1960s, we had quite a low level of average tariffs across the world, under 10%. It actually reached just at the end of the 21st century, just about 3%. Average tariffs on imports across the world were about 3%, very low. So it really was, that's free trade. That was, but the end of globalization, as we saw earlier, has led to this change. And now Trump's tariffs increases will take it up to around about 18% as of before yesterday. I can't work out what he's done yesterday. It's complete confusion, and nobody else has been able to come up with an answer. But basically, it's something like that. That's a big increase. Is this going to help the US economy? Well, Trump says that we're going to, by the end of the year, we'll have raised $300 billion from extra tariffs, these tariffs. Previously, tariffs raised about 150 billion. So he's going to increase income for the government of 150 billion. But he's also made huge cuts in his budget bill, not only on welfare cuts, but also mainly on cuts to corporate profits, tax, on removing all kinds of other measures that will benefit and reduce revenues for the government. And the deficit is going to be running at something like 2 trillion a year. So he's gaining 150 billion from extra tariffs, and he's still going to have, the government's still going to have to spend 2 trillion more than it's got in revenues, so it'll have to borrow more. So it hasn't really solved the fiscal problem, if that's what the aim is. It's really a proposal, in my view, not much to do with that. It's to do with trying to put the squeeze on the rest of the world. So what we have a position is, if interest rates continue to rise or stay high as they have been, and the dollar doesn't collapse, and I don't think it will, then the rest of the world's in real trouble, because it's got a huge level of debt, and there are 3.4 billion people now living in countries that spend more on the interest on the debt that they owe to the United States, to the banks, to the multinationals around the world, than they can spend on health or education. That's an indication of the distortion that's going on through the massive increase in global debt for the poorest countries of the world. Finally, what's the answer for capitalism? Well, I'm going to propose 3 options for capitalism here in 2025 to get out of this. Don't think they'll take my advice, but this is what I propose that capitalist leaders should do. First of all, probably what they should do is allow a slump. They should allow the economy to collapse. This will create conditions wiping out lots of inefficient companies and inefficient employees, reducing the, for a period of time, production and investment, but then creating a leaner, more efficient workforce after a big slump that will create that condition. So it means destroying the value of old capital, which is no longer productive, and creating conditions for the new capital, like artificial intelligence and so on, to really take forward productivity of labour and boost profitability. That's been the traditional way that capitalism has managed to have a new period of life. A big slump, then a period of growth for a time. That's increasingly difficult in the 21st century. Each major slump they've had, and they've got bigger, like the Great Recession, like the pandemic slump, have not produced that sharp increase in productivity and profitability afterwards. But that's one possibility. The next possibility is that precisely in that situation, to use the new forms of technological development that are taking place in this decade of the 2020s, robots, in particular artificial intelligence, which is now the craze of the stock market, of the big mega companies running artificial intelligence. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars investing in data centers across the US, even in Portugal and Ireland, all over the world. What are the data centers for? They bring all the processors together, which collect all the information, so that when you go on your computer on ChatGPT and you ask it a question, it sucks up the data it's got in these data centers and converts it into answers. This is going to transform the world, according to the big tech companies. And so that is another possibility. It's going to succeed in changing the position for capitalism by wiping out jobs for hundreds of millions of people who currently do those sorts of jobs that AI could replace, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in dealing with companies' requests and all the rest of it, all those areas where it could possibly reduce labour and therefore boost productivity and also, hopefully, profitability is the aim also. The third one, if neither of those work, is inevitably an increased tension between the world, not just on trade, not just on investment, but also perhaps militarily. We shall see an increased level of conflict between different countries, perhaps leading to major development or war or defeat. That's happened in the past, in the 1850s, the 1920s, and the 1950s were periods where capitalism recovered because it carried out a war, a major war, which led to the situation of being able to expand capitalist production at the expense of hundreds of millions of people being injured or dying and destruction of the world. That's the real danger. So is a new slump happening before the end of the decade? Well, financial asset prices are already out of line with earnings. Trump's tariffs today produced an increase in the stock market. As far as they're concerned, they're not worried about tariffs. They're just seeing AI, super intelligence. Everybody in this room will no longer be here, including me, and all we'll have is a button which produces this presentation by AI. And that's what they've got in mind. And that situation is producing a massive increase in the stock market, which is now out of control. This is insanity at the levels of prices for these big mega companies. And they're spending huge amounts of money. They don't deliver on revenues. So if they don't deliver on profits over the next few years, then we could see a very sharp decline in the stock market, a crash, which could create a situation for that slump I was talking about. Already profits growth in the major economies are grinding to a halt. Leave aside the so-called Magnificent Seven, the top 7 mega tech companies in the world, who are still making big profits, not out of AI, by the way. They're making no money from AI at the moment. They're making it from what they did before, whether it's Facebook's advertising, whether it's Amazon's cloud computing, all these previous developments that they've made, but not from AI. But the rest of the corporate sector, not only in the US, but in Europe and Japan, is making little or no profit at all. It's slowing down quite fast. If profits slow down, investment will slow down, as we've seen, and that could create the situation for a slump too. And we've just seen that global debt is at record levels, 4 countries in distress. All those are factors that suggest that we could have a new slump before the end of this decade. And inflation and interest rates could turn up. Now, we're told that inflation is the central banks of the world have been able to get inflation down towards their target of 2%. Capitalism thinks a moderate growth in prices is okay because it helps to boost profit and keep the market going. They don't want too high inflation because that squeezes the demand. They don't want deflation or no inflation because they can't make so much profit out of that. There's only one country in the world that has no inflation of major proportions. That's China. West economists spend all the time saying China's got deflation and no inflation. As one person wrote, it's very unfortunate when I go in China, no prices rise, and they tend to fall. I feel, I'm really unhappy about the situation. But of course, over in the US, inflation is not coming to 2%, which is the target of the Fed or the ECB. In Europe, it's rising as of today back towards 3%. Inflation is coming back, and we still haven't had the impact of Trump's tariffs on import prices feeding through to the consumer. And interest rates could rise, so all this could just squeeze everything as we go. So, as I say, the boom in AI is massive. Will that turn out to be a bubble? Let me just show you. This is quite an important graph. I think it's done by, I think it's the OECD. See if I can explain this to you. Worth just understanding this graph. Down at the bottom left-hand corner here, if you see the key here, we've got the blue triangle is personal computers. The green block is electric power, and the diamond red is AI. So if we start with the green block, in 1900 was when electric power diffused around the major firms using that technology to about 5% of firms that were using electric power in 1900, not very much. It took to 1909 for 25% to be using it, and then 1914 to nearly at 40%, and finally, you could say that way beyond the end of this century in the world, over nearly 60% of all firms use electricity in one form or another. So it takes a long time for a very important technological development to work through. If we look at PCs, which is the pyramid there, triangle, 1984, you could say PCs had basically covered about 25% of firms. It crawls up, and we can see that by 2003, again, nearly over 50% were using PCs, firms, and everyone uses them here now. So you've got a rise from 1984 to the end of the century before it diffuses across the economy. Starts off with a small number and then diffuses. What about AI? Well, AI is the diamond. It's down there in 2024. It's about 5%. Is it? Dear, oh dear. That's technology for you. That looks like a commercial called spam. Or maybe it was the wife. Anyway, so 2024, you can see under just about 5%. So if takes about 20 years to diffuse new technologies, here we are in 2024-25, then you wouldn't expect AI, if it's a successful technology, to actually be diffused across the economy for another 20 years, up to 2045. Oh, well, it's going to be quicker. It's going to be super intelligent. Okay, well, we'll see. But anyway, you're talking about a long time for diffusion before this becomes something that everybody starts using in an effective way that makes a difference to the economy. And what we've seen also in this increase in tensions around the world is a switch from welfare to warfare. We're now told by governments that, yeah, we have to make cuts in people's welfare conditions, disability benefits in the UK, the winter fuel allowance, and in the case of the US, that Trump's new bill will cut 24 million people out of Medicare. That's the bill that's going through Congress at the moment. This is all to save money in order to do what? To increase spending in military expenditure in general. Trump is now going to spend $1 trillion a year on military spending. That doesn't include homeland security and grabbing you off the streets if you're an immigrant. That's extra expenditure. All that is building up, and we see that also in Europe, where NATO and European countries have committed themselves to increase military spending from approximately 1.5% of GDP at the moment to 5% of GDP by some date by the end of this decade. That's a massive, massive increase in investment. And that means that there's increasing danger that as we have entered this new arms race, using up the resources for the economy, that we're entering the dangers of war. I just finished nearly on the end with a quote from Engels in 1887, where he said, this is a really difficult, with systematic development of mutual one-upmanship in arms. This arms race will lead to a world war, moreover, of an extent of violence hitherto unimagined. 8 to 10 million soldiers will be at each other's throats, and in the process they will strip Europe barer than a swarm of locusts. He wrote that in 1887, and it didn't happen, of course, until 25 years later. Is that how much time we've got left before we can have a new situation similarly, this time with nuclear weaponry involved? The rearmament process is underway, and that's the danger we could see as we go towards the end of this decade and beyond. We have wars in Ukraine with no end in sight. As far as I can see, no settlement, no possibility of a settlement, but as far as I can see. And of course, the growing tensions over Taiwan. The UK Defence Minister says that we're ready to fight to the death to save Taiwan. I don't know who he's referring to, fighting to the death, but I don't think I'll be joining him. But that's the tension that's building up. That's the key position at the end. The end of this piece is to say the big issue is the position between the US and China and what happens to the economic rivalry between these two economic powers. The old hegemonic power is in relative decline. The new rising power economically is a threat to that position, and the various junior allies of that hegemonic power, Europe and Japan, are lining up behind the US to try and strangle China economically, diplomatically, militarily, and if necessary, in terms of actual war. We shall see. Can capitalism be space? Well, as I said, I'll just remind you, those are the three things that I think are the options ahead for the capitalist economy in the 2020s and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael.